All right, we will continue today in Acts. If you remember last time we talked about how Paul got to Jerusalem, and I do want to point out that the story how Paul got to Jerusalem, I think there are rightfully different opinions about it. And we know that Paul was warned, as I mentioned it last time. But what I kind of skipped over, I did not recognize. Um, Brother Roy pointed that out to me that um, there were basically two times in chapter 21. One time he gets warned that he will get, imprisoned and that trouble will await him. But then also in one verse, I think it's chapter 21, verse 4, it says, and they kept telling Paul through the Spirit not to set foot in Jerusalem. And this is the reason why some people also say, or not sure if it was the way that, or if Paul decided on his own to go there. But I think it's a difficult question because if we turn to Acts chapter 20, verse same chapter in verse 22, it says also Paul says, "And now behold, bound by the Spirit, I'm on my way to Jerusalem, not knowing what will happen to me there." So I think it's a very difficult question. Uh, but either way, we see when Paul was in Jerusalem, when he faced all the trouble, one thing is clear: God appears to him and encourages him. So God was with him in Jerusalem. So I think this is the most important message here, and I think we all have to understand that Paul was. While he was a godly man, he was still a human, and there could have been. I think this is better now. I think Paul was still a human, and there could be, different opinions. But I do think that Paul still made his decisions in the Lord, and I think this is also kind of a lesson for us, even with if we are among Christians as a church. Sometimes there can be different opinions on what to do next or how to go forward. And I think even here we see this where there were brothers who clearly warned him to not go, and he decided to go. But I think they all had the same intention. They all wanted to do what God wants. Paul did not want to walk away from God or anything like that. That is clear, that is obvious. Paul was not like Jonah, who, decided to go in a different direction. He wanted to glorify God, and it was on his heart to bring the gospel there. As we already in Acts chapter 19, I think Paul is already mentioning that he wants to go to Jerusalem, and from there he wants to go up to Rome. So this was always an intention he had. And as we continue the story now, we clearly see that God was with Paul, and even on his way to Rome, as we will move forward, we will see how God used Paul to bring people to Christ, to save, how God used Paul to save people. And again, we do have to remember Paul went to Rome, and when we read the Bible, we think that the center of history was Jerusalem, which it was for biblical purposes, but the center of the world was Rome at that time, and that Paul ended up making it to Rome. This has really changed the course of history, and this has really made sure that the gospel will reach every place in this world. So, as I said, we had last time we looked into it how he was dragged before different councils and uproars happened, and you could say that Paul was a few times on brink of death because kind of mobs who came up, and every time he kind of got saved because he was a Roman, so the Roman soldiers made sure that nothing happened to him. Again, as we it has been quite a while, but we watched this video about the dynasty of Herod. Jerusalem was under occupation, so the Romans were in charge, and they still had the Jews kind of ruling, but the ultimate authority were the Romans. And as we know, Paul was a Roman citizen, so he had a different rights, and there was no way that the Jews were allowed to lay hands on him without a Roman approval. So this is where we find ourselves now. Paul is still in Jerusalem, and then if we continue here in chapter 23, again we always have Paul defending himself before different authorities. And last time we ended with chapter 23, verse 11, where again, but on the night immediately following, the Lord stood at his side, at Paul's side, and said, "Take courage, for as you have solemnly witnessed to my cause at Jerusalem, so you must witness at Rome also." Again, this is obviously the confirmation that God was with him, and that God clearly acknowledged that Paul has witnessed, and that he will bring bring him through it, and that he will make sure that he gets to Rome. And just as we continue here, immediately another conspiracy comes up to kill Paul, and these were the Jews. There were some Jews, I think it was 40 of them. They really dedicated themselves to the cause of killing Paul. They said, "We will kill Paul, and until then, we will not eat and drink." And then it was, I think, the son of Paul's sister. Uh, We don't know if he was a young lad but well, he was a young man or a boy, whoever. He got kind of heard of it, so he went to Paul and told him, "Hey, there are those 40 people. They really planning to kill you, and their plan was that they wanted to inquire of Paul again to give a testimony, and then uh, when Paul would get taken down to the council, they wanted to wait for him on the side street. I don't know, but they wanted to kill him." And this young boy went to Paul, and Paul sent this young boy to the Roman centurion, and the young boy talked to the centurion, to the commander, and based on that, the commander act. And this is in verse 23. And this again shows that authority the Romans had, and also the position Paul had as a Roman citizen. There was quite something they put together for him to make sure that he stays alive. And he called to him two of the centurions and said, "Get 200 soldiers ready by the third hour of the night to proceed to Caesarea with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen." So this was quite a group of people to protect Paul here, that were given the task to make sure that he gets to Caesarea, and that he gets there safe. And if you think about all this, the Romans were a pagan people, and they could have also kind of at some point said, what are we even dealing with this man? We can just send him there, and hopefully somebody snatches him on the way and the problem is solved. But they were really dedicated to the safety. And I think this again comes because God had his hand over him, and God wanted to make sure he gets to Rome. And that's why we have this all happening here. And they brought him safely to Felix, to the governor, and they gave him a letter. So again, he went from Jerusalem to this governor who lived in Caesarea, the Roman governor who was in charge of this whole area, and they sent him there to also have a hearing there. And this was kind of the first, yeah, you can call it court date in front of the governor. And that's why in chapter 24, kind of get a kind of an idea. The atmosphere. We have the high priest Ananias came down with some elders with an attorney, and this is kind of more now the courtroom setup. They have indictments against Paul, and again here we have Paul to give defense, and again Paul does not bring any attorney. He is speaking for himself, and he's then addressing the governor, and then we have again we have the Jews attacking him before this occurred and bringing all these accusations again against him, and obviously these accusations are false, just as we for example in verse 6 or in verse 5 it says, "For we have found this man a real pest and a fellow who stirs up dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader to the sect of the Nazarenes, and he even tried to disintegrate the temple, and then we arrested him. We wanted to judge him according to our own law." And obviously these accusations were false. Paul never desecrated the temple, and also this argument that he stirs up dissension among all the Jews. It was mostly always the Jews that stirred up the people against him and not Paul. So these are the accusations, and then in verse 10 we read that the governor had nodded for him to speak. So Paul then responds, and Paul gives his defensive speak again, and it basically he makes the arguments that he obviously did not do what they said. In verse 12, neither in the temple nor in the synagogues nor in the city itself did they find me carrying on a discussion with any one or causing a riot, nor can they prove to you the charges of which they now accuse me. But this I admit to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, I do serve the God of our fathers, believing everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men cherish themselves, that there shall certainly be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. In view of this, I also do my best to maintain always a blameless conscience, both before God and before man. And now, after several years, I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings, in which they found me occupied in the temple, having been purified without any crowd or uproar. But there were some Jews from Asia who ought to have been present before you to make accusation if they should have anything against me. Again, Paul is kind of identifying with them, say, hey, I'm serving God, and according to, because we know that Paul came from the Jews, he was raised as a Jew, he had all the teaching. And again, he brings up the resurrection of both the righteous and wicked, and that he is believing in the resurrection. And the great dispute here was obviously that Paul has seen the resurrected Lord, and when the Lord appeared to him, and the Jews obviously did not believe in the resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ. And this was the steer up, and this was the main difference. And until this day, um, of course, there are saved Jews, but great majority still does not believe that Jesus is the Messiah and that Jesus brought salvation. So this has not changed until today. And then we have again the speak of Paul here. He's defending himself, and um, Felix really kind of ends up. He doesn't really know what to do with this man, and the picture comes clearly that Felix is really torn in between. There's not any judgment, but then it also says that Felix was a Roman man who basically then approached it that he was just trying to get the most out of him. And as we read, if we continue in verse 24, but some days later Felix arrived with Drusilla, his wife, who was a Jew, and sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. But as he was discussing righteousness, self control, and the judgment to come, Felix became frightened and said, "Go away for the present, and when I find time, I will summon you." So again, Felix is not dismissing what Paul is saying. In fact, he's kind of getting afraid of it, and then he's like, "I don't even want to hear it for now." And he sends him away, but only sending him away in a form of like putting him in custody. And says, "When I find time, I will summon you." And at the same time, too, he was hoping that money would be given him by Paul. Therefore, he also used to send for him quite often and converse with him. So it was, I think it was also kind of mentioned in that video that we watched that this governor was spending actually a lot of time with Paul, and they had conversations, and it sounds like they were like deeper conversations. Um, And then this just, when we read it, we would think that went on for a few weeks, but in fact it says, but after 2 years had passed. So this was happening for 2 years, that Paul was kind of imprisoned, but he was imprisoned in the way that the governor wanted to have like a kind of a fellowship with him and had conversation with him on a regular basis, and that Paul, as we know, Paul clearly always testified to this Felix. And then we don't really know what happened to Felix. We just read then that his time as a governor was over. And then when he was taken out of office, removed from office, Paul was just still in custody, still in prison. There was never any judgment. It was just, he just was left in prison. And then we have the next governor coming, Festus, and then he's finally coming up, went from Jerusalem to, or went up to Jerusalem. And then we have the same priests again, the Jews, kind of bringing up Paul again. And I think at this point, Festus isn't even, I mean, he was just kind of taking office and getting himself settled with his task and what he had to do as governor, and then he's going up to Jerusalem, and again the Jews bringing up Paul and kind of reminding him, hey, there's still this man in prison, and they want to have him killed, and they still have this pledge to kill him. At this point, remember, we had these men who dedicated themselves to kill Paul until the point that they won't eat. Those men probably have been dead by this time if they continued with their pledge. But the Jews still had pledged to kill him. They wanted to ambush him. And then Festus is kind of learning about Paul. And therefore he said, let the influential people among you go there with me, and if there's anything wrong about the man, let them prosecute him. Again, so at this point, there must have been also probably some kind of frustration with the Jews, because now they had to start at zero again, a new governor, and now they have to make their case again. And clearly they didn't have a case, that's why Paul was still there. And now it's the new governor, and he's saying, "Okay, let us go up to him and bring forth your case." And again, this has been 2 years, and in verse 7 we have then again the same situation. After Paul arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him, which they could not prove. While Paul said in his own defense, I have committed no offense either against the law of the Jews, or against the temple, or against Caesar. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me on the charges? But Paul said, I am standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. I have done no wrong to the Jews, as you also very well know. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything worthy of death, I do not refuse to die. But if none of these things is true of which these men accuse me, no one can hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. And then, when Festus had conferred with his council, he answered, you have appealed to Caesar. To Caesar you shall go. And this is the final turnaround here. Festus is offering him again, okay, we can go up to Jerusalem and have this trial again with the Jews. And Paul here is making kind of the decision, or brings up, well, I don't have to go up there again because it just, those trials don't go anywhere. And he's appealing to Caesar, which he had a right to as Roman citizen. And the answer here of this governor Festus is clear. You appeal to Caesar you shall go. And again, I think this verse just confirms what we read a few chapters earlier, where God is telling Paul, hey, you will go up to Rome. And here he gets the confirmation that he will go up to Rome. And then we have still another hearing, but this is not a trial. This is, and I think we also touched on it in this video, there was still this king in for the Jews, Agrippa. He was more uh, like he had not really power. It's more like a puppet, you know. It's like almost like the King of England, maybe. It's just kind of, you know, there is a king. And Agrippa was, as we obviously learned in this video, he was just a very, he was an immoral man. He lived with his sister, kind of. So this just kind of like in a relationship, and which was for, if you look in the Old Testament, which was clearly against the law, and this man called himself the King of the Jews, and having a relationship, open relationship with his sister, shows you the state this land was in, the country was in, that the King of the Jews was a man living with his sister openly, and he was just interested in who Paul is, and he wanted to get known to him. He wanted to learn from him. So again, when Paul was brought before Agrippa, the decision was already made that he would go to Rome, and that's where the trial will happen. But still, Festus brings Paul to before Agrippa, and again, then we have in in chapter 26, we have Paul speak, or still it's kind of a defense before Agrippa. And in this chapter again, Paul is basically just kind of repeating his testimony from the point where he again reminds him that I know I know the Jews. I've been one of them. That's where I was raised. I was taught in all this. And then Jesus appeared to him and he turned around his life. And this is what he is testifying again in verse 13 in that chapter 26. At midday, O king, I saw on the way a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, shining all around me and those who were journeying me. And when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in Hebrew dialect, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to cook against the gods. And I said, Who are you, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. And then Paul again is telling him the story how he then gets up after he lost sight. And in verse 18 it says, To open their eyes, or in 17, rescuing you from the Jewish people and from the Gentiles to whom I'm sending you, to open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light, from the dominion of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and inheritance among those who have been sanctified by faith in me. Again, on this trip to Damascus, Paul was sent out to persecute Christians, but God appeared to him and his whole mission changed. From there, he was sent out to bring the gospel to the Gentiles and to the Jews. And then he just kind of continue his speak and kind of bring this case that he never did anything wrong against the Jews. In fact, he wants to just bring the truth to them. And then we have in 24, while Paul was saying this in his defense, Festus said in a loud voice, Paul, you are out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you mad. But Paul said, I'm not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I utter words of sober truth. And when I read this, I think if we give testimony today, as we also read, as we also listen to this messages from Ken Ham, I think sometimes the world comes up maybe with the same conclusions as you guys are out of your mind. Stuff you are talking about, you are out of your mind. And this is what happened to this Festus here in the midst. He just all of a sudden he's just like, you are out of your mind. And I don't know if you have heard this before in your life. Somebody told you that you are out of your mind about the stuff you're talking. This is nothing uncommon. Paul heard the same, and Paul's answer here is pretty simple. He says, But I utter words of sober truth. And we shouldn't be surprised in this world if the word of truth seems to be madness for the people around us. This is this again shouldn't surprise us and shouldn't discourage us to speak about these matters, to preach the gospel. And he then continues, For the king knows about these matters, and I speak to him also with confidence, since I am persuaded that none of these things escape his notice. For this has not been done in a corner. And King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? And I think this was an interesting question because, as the king of the Jews, he had to believe the prophets. And I think, in a way, Paul again is kind of cornering him, and then the king does not give him an answer. And Paul said, Well, I know that you do, because you have to, as the king of the Jews. And then we have this reply, this famous reply from this king. Again, this was not good king. This was an evil man. He lived in immorality and he didn't really care about anything. He just uh, lived a terrible life and in life full of immorality. And he said, in a short time, you will persuade me to become a Christian. And this, I think it was also mentioned in that series that we watched. This was more like a mocking. I think this was more like a mocking response. This was not a sincere comment. And again, Paul's response to this is still, I would wish to God that whether in a short or long time, not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become as such as I am, except for these chains. And again, this was in all the controversy that we talked about, how Paul got to Jerusalem. This was what Paul always had in mind. He wanted to have people saved and to find the truth. And despite the difference is that the difference opinion that were there, that some people said you shouldn't go and Paul said I will go, this was on his mind to get people saved, and God was with Paul all the time. I'm convinced of that. I mean, the Bible makes it clear. And he's giving all these testimonies in front of all these people. And again, this is not the end. As we continue here, the king stood up, and the governor and Bernice and those who were sitting with them, and they had gone aside, and they began talking to one another, saying, this man is not doing anything worthy of death or imprisonment. And again, we have to remember Paul was already in prison, in custody for a few years by then. And those men, again, come to the same conclusion, well, there's actually nothing he did really wrong. But then in verse 32, this man might have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. And this is what we read in the chapter before. He appealed to Caesar, so Festus said, you will go to Caesar. And this is also the conclusion here. This man might have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. But again, some people say, well, the reason why Paul ended up in Rome was because he appealed to Caesar. The reason why Paul went to Rome was because God wanted to have him there. And this is, I think this, as we read through it, this becomes clear to me. It was the road to Rome that Paul was set to go there. And I think it's just a beautiful story again, how God just interacts with history and with, with the proceedings. But if you remember when Pilate brought the charges against Jesus, and Pilate said, I have authority, Jesus told him, the only authority you have is what I give to you. And I think I see the same in this story. At no point God was not in charge. God had it all in control here, and God led Paul the way he led him. And I think this is also something we can learn for our lives. We are raised in, as humans, we are raised, if you're good behavior, you get ice cream, and if not, you have to stick with broccoli or whatever. And sometimes I think we do the same with our lives, that we say, well, if something bad happens to us, we did something wrong. But that's not always the case. This is not how God raises us, as we uh, learn also this morning. And Paul encountered a lot of trouble, but God was with him. And sometimes we encounter trouble and hard times, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we have left the right way. God has never promised us a life full of comfort and no trouble. That's not what he promised us. So I think we, just like Paul, I think if our main focus is always on that we glorify God and that we bring forth his name, our ways will be blessed. But it doesn't mean that there are no hard ways and no trouble. So Let us focus on the Lord, and He will guide us, and He will make sure that there will be glory to Him, and He will not leave us, just like He never left Paul. Oh Lord, thank you for this time we had this morning, and thank you that we are in your hand, and your ways are higher than our ways. And who are we that we could understand your ways? And we pray that you will give us patience, that you will give us wisdom, so that we will walk in your will, and that we will not back down. And just as Paul went through these times, maybe sometimes we have these hard times and we don't fully understand where you will lead us. Just help us that we trust you, because you will be always faithful. You will never leave us, and we praise you for the promises that you have given us. And we pray in your precious name. Amen.